Last week, I had a video with Michael Herrera. He's an ex-Marine who says he was in Indonesia when he saw a giant, weird shaped floating craft, and it was actually transporting what he said were psionic assets. So, people, he was then held at gunpoint by American operatives and all black. And fast forward to just a year ago, he says he went out into the desert and went underground with an insider who said they do want to come out. And this insider said that they use psionic assets, so people who use their mind to actually control alien technology. And a week before that, I had Courtney Brown on the show. He's a professor, and argues that he's been actually in communication with extraterrestrials through telepathy again. So he communicates with these ETs who said that there will be larger drones in the coming month and that we should be looking outside. This is effectively disclosure that they are trying to help us. But he communicates through telepathy. And if you haven't heard the Telepathy Tapes podcast yet, it's the #1 podcast in the US. Basic argument is that these nonverbal autistic kids can communicate with their mind. So these kids can actually communicate with their mothers telepathically. They can communicate with other kids telepathically, and there's no distance related to it. After my last two interviews, people basically said, what's wrong with Chris? Has he gone crazy? But if you look, every single alien interaction that I've ever heard of, they communicate telepathically, right? The aliens communicate telepathically. There's no one that says, hey, they walked up to me and started talking to me. Or if they do talk, they still communicate telepathically. Out of all the thousands of cases, telepathic communication seems to be one of the common points, right? Aliens communicate telepathically, which is funny because our Sadie hasn't been looking at any of that or even considering it, right? But what is holding up our modern science? What is the issue? Why can we not believe it? I think the reason modern science doesn't take any of this seriously goes back to the double-slit experiment and the Michelson-Morley experiment from 1887, right? There's no medium through which we can actually have these communications. Telepathy isn't real because there's no physical process. Astrology could not be any way towards correct, right? There's nothing remotely correct in astrology because there can't be an actual mechanism. There's no medium that connects us to the cosmic planets or the rest of the universe, right? There's no way that Courtney Brown could be communicating with extraterrestrials because telepathy doesn't exist. There's no reason that the kids, autistic kids in the telepathy tapes, can be communicating with their parents or reading the minds of anyone else, actually, right? Because there's no medium. Never mind that the CIA had a Stargate program. Never mind they had a remote viewing program, right? If you could read someone else's mind, that's a pretty powerful tool, right? If they didn't know about it, it'd be pretty useful for intelligence, national security type reasons, wouldn't it? So I think it goes back to the double-slit experiment. This is the cornerstone of quantum mechanics and really the ultimate mind bender. Fire electrons or anything up to 2,000 atoms, really, one at a time through two slits, and you get an interference pattern on the wall as if they're waves. But what are they? Are they particles? That's what our modern physics says, that they're particles. Or are they waves if they're interfering? Doesn't it seem like they're waves, or are they something else entirely? So today on LehtoFiles, we'll show you how a wave-based reality solves this mystery, right? Solves the double-slit experiment and can explain why telepathy could be possible. We'll explain why it makes so much sense and why modern physics still resists the idea. So stick around to the end and we'll talk about experiments that could finally prove this wave-based view of reality. Thanks for being here. Chris Lehto, welcome to LehtoFiles. Okay, let's start with the classic setup. So you fire individual particles, if you will, in this case, electrons, at a barrier with two slits. And when you measure which slit the actual particle goes through, it behaves like a particle, right? So if you measure it, it behaves like a particle. If we block one of these slits to detect, now it will behave like a particle, two bright spots or one bright spot on the back of the wall. But when you don't measure it, right? When you don't measure it, something magical happens. It's magic, right? An interference pattern appears as if the electron passed through both slits simultaneously and interfered with itself. So, this is the core of quantum mechanics. Physicists call it wave particle duality. But does that duality really exist? Or are we just misunderstanding the nature of reality? So, in the 1920s, physicist Prince Louis de Broglie proposed something revolutionary. He proposed that all matter is fundamentally wave-like. He gave us this equation: wavelength, de Broglie wavelength, equals h, Planck's constant, over the mass of the particle times the velocity of the particle. So since light waves have a particle behavior, he thought, as shown by Einstein in the photoelectric effect, then particles should have a wave behavior as well, right? That's what he argued. And it turns out it does. So he proved this, right? He basically proved the electron is not like Bohr thought, just orbiting like a planet, right? It's not orbiting. It's actually just a field, right? It's a wave, essentially. The electron is a wave. And he found the wavelength of matter waves, right? That's the de Broglie wavelength. And that's equals to Planck's constant over the mass of the particle times the velocity of the moving particle. That's the momentum, really. So it's Planck's constant over the momentum of the particle. And this is the wave nature of the electron. That's what he proved. The electron is not a thing, particle in essence. It is a wave. This is proven in atomic physics, right? So de Broglie hypothesized that if light could behave like particles, then particles could behave like waves. So this means all forms of matter have wave-like properties, right? All forms of matter have wave-like properties. That means matter is waves, and it follows his equation, right? We still don't know what Planck's constant comes from, right? It just comes out of thin air. This magical number h just comes out of thin air. We don't know. So this means that every object has a wavelength. So that means even you have a wavelength. But for objects like baseballs, the wavelength is so small, it's impossible to detect. For electrons, it's measurable. And experiments like electron diffraction proved de Broglie right. Matter is waves. All forms of matter are waves. So when electrons pass through a double slit, they act like waves. They're spreading out and interfering to create patterns. What we call particles are simply localized interactions of waves with the detector. Okay, so it's just waves interacting with waves on the detector. So that means if this screen is made of waves, right, in a certain pattern, and you shoot a wave at it, you are going to get a certain interaction. And we call that interaction collapse of the wave function, right? We call that particle interaction, but really it's just wave to wave interaction. And when you go to measure, right, when we go to do a measurement, this is the measurement problem, and you put any sort of detector in here, now what is happening? You are interfering with the wave. How do waves spread? Waves spread in a sphere, right? Waves spread in a sphere. So as this wave of an electron is going this direction, okay, it's actually a sphere. That's why if I interact with it here in this slit, it is going to affect the rest of the wave. And so now that's why I will get a different pattern. That's why you get a particle pattern, because you're actually interfering with the wave. Any measurement, you have to actually interfere with the wave. So you're getting a wave-to-wave interaction. You're going to somehow collapse the wave function, if we will, or affect it. This is why a photon, right, can only split into two entangled photons. Okay, there's different ways to make multiple photons after that, but you're only splitting those in twos. You're only splitting a photon into two parts. Okay, they have to add up to the original photon. So again, I think you're just seeing wave-wave interactions. So basically, let's break it down. Okay, interference patterns, that's wave behavior. Polarization of light, also waves. Even gravitational waves are pure ripples in spacetime, they say, ripples in spacetime. We'll look at the Morley-Michelson experiment next and show you it looks a lot like a LIGO interferometer, right? So maybe all we're detecting when we detect gravitational waves is actual ripples in the ether, right, in the medium. But everything points to waves as the true nature of reality. The so-called particles we detect are just localized effects, wave packets interacting with detectors. Particles, as we traditionally imagine them, are an illusion. If you look now at our current quantum field theory, right, the most accurate theory ever in physics, it's made up of fields. So you have the up quark field, right? You have the proton field, which is just an excitation in the proton field. That's what a proton is in our current model of physics, our best model of physics, right? Quantum field theory. An electron is just an excitation in the electron field. Okay, looks exactly the same as in the past when we had the geocentric model of the universe, right? When the Earth was the center, and they divided up the heavens into different planes, and you had the moon plane, and you had the sun plane, and you had the planets plane, right? They each had their own plane or field, right? A plane is basically a field in many aspects. And then you had the stars field. Okay, so they just divided everything up into different fields. That's what they did in the past using complicated mathematics. Why? Because they could mathematically accurately describe the universe. They could describe where the moon would be in the future, right? They could describe where Mars would be in the future, where the stars would be in the future, right? It was very accurate, but it was incorrect. The underlying fundamental assumption was incorrect. The Earth was not the center of the universe, right? If you put the sun as the center of the solar system, now it makes a lot more sense. You don't need all this difficult math. You don't need Fourier transforms. Now you can use simple elliptical math, right? Simple circular math makes it much simpler. Why? Because your underlying assumption is correct. So if we look now, there are no particles. Okay, they can't find any particles. Look for a particle in our actual physics in the real world. Try and find a particle. You won't find a particle. What you're going to find is an excitation in a field. Even the Higgs boson, right? The Higgs particle is really just an excitation in the Higgs field, right? So they split it up just like the past. Okay, so what I believe is that Nikola Tesla, when he said that the universe is made up of vibrations, frequency of energy, that's what we're going to find is that there's one actual main field, right? There's one main field called the ether, some sort of medium. And what we see is just different effects at different scales, right? If you notice, these are all different scales. The electron is a much different scale than the proton, than the quark, than the Higgs. So I think gravity will also emerge from this as some sort of underlying relationship between different waves, so wave on wave interaction at different scales is what we're going to find. And so in this way, we could actually make a physical process for telepathy, right? There's an actual medium that we can communicate with our brains. If you're made of waves, if I'm made of waves, and my brain creates waves, right? We know the brain creates waves. We have brain wave frequencies that correspond to our actual conscious states. Then that gives a mechanism now where we could actually communicate telepathically, somehow interact with each other on wave interactions. This would also give a mechanism for crazy concepts like astrology, right? Going back thousands and thousands of years. Maybe those humans thousands of years ago, up until modern times, maybe they actually had some sort of knowledge about underlying reality that our current physics can't accept, right? Can't understand. So if a wave-based explanation works so well, why hasn't physics embraced it? And the answer really comes down to one word: ether, or the ether, two words. And the reason modern science doesn't like the ether goes back to the 19th century. So in the 19th century, scientists believed that light waves needed a medium to travel through, right? Just like sound needs air or water. They called this medium the ether. So they believed that. But then came the Michelson-Morley experiment, and that was in 1887. And it failed to detect an ether. So what they did is they had a light source. They don't have a laser, but they had a light source, and they split the light source into two equal lengths. So two equal columns, if you will, just like the LIGO interferometer. and they sent the light down 2 equal length paths and then measured the time it took to go that distance, right? The speed of the light in 90-degree columns. And if the Earth was moving through a medium such as the ether, then the speed of light should be different depending on which direction the Earth is going, right? Well, according to this experiment, it failed to detect the ether because the light went the same speed along both those paths, 90 degrees out. If you look, though, our gravitational wave detectors, right? They use 4-kilometer long light paths. They detected different speeds. So light was actually traveling different speeds down these two 90-degree lengths. So it's basically a modern Michelson-Morley experiment that is finding gravitational waves, right? Could that actually be proof that the ether exists? Could it be proof? But according to this experiment, 1887, it proved that light doesn't need a vacuum, right? The light can just travel like an object, like a rock, out in nothing, right? Out in the vacuum, if you will, of space. So it can travel through the vacuum of space. The idea of the ether was abandoned, and physics turned to the particle concept instead. And never mind that Einstein, his first theory was the variable speed of light theory, and de Broglie proved that matter is waves. Nikola Tesla also thought the universe is all frequency and vibration, right? He thought it was also an ether. They stuck with particles, and I think this was actually on purpose. So there basically is a modern day ether, and it's the fields are the medium, right? So in the wave-based view of reality, fields take the place of the ether. So for light, the electromagnetic field acts as the medium, right? For matter waves, it's the quantum field. So these fields are not made of physical stuff. They're fundamental to the universe. That's our current quantum field theory, right? This is our current model of physics. And yet there's still a duality, right? The waves we observe are oscillations in these fields, and they're all interconnected, but separate. So just like in the past, different planes of existence. The moon was in a different plane. Sun was in a different plane, right? Different field. Mars was in a different field. And what Newton did was he actually changed the scales. So the same gravity that would affect something as large as the moon, that would affect the sun, the same force affects us, right? Affects the apple on the earth. So really, he unified the scales. I think we'll see a similar unification of the medium, right? Which is really just split up into all these different fields now. So this explains why waves work at every scale. So from the ripples in space-time caused by black holes to the quantum interference that we see in the double-slit experiment. Waves don't need particles, right? They only need fields. They only need fields, which sounds a lot like an ether to me. So the big takeaway, right, is telepathy, psionic assets, extraterrestrial communication. All of these things, I think, go back to the double-slit experiment, right? And our confusion on, is it a particle or is it a wave? And you can't have both at the same time. I think de Broglie proved that matter is a wave, and we saw that light is a wave. So the double-slit experiment, all the mysteries of quantum mechanics, all these crazy things we're hearing about extraterrestrial communication, Michael Herrera's story, Courtney Brown, the telepathy tapes, all this stuff starts to make sense when we abandon particles, right? And when we embrace waves. So the universe isn't made of tiny little objects bouncing around, right? It's made of waves interacting, interfering, and shaping all of reality. So why does mainstream physics still resist this idea? Because this idea of a modern medium, right? A modern ether breaks all of their underlying fundamental assumptions about the nature of the universe, right? What is consciousness then? If we're all made of waves, how does consciousness interact? It seems like we're all coming from the same conscious field, but we use fields now, right? Fields are just the new ether split into different planes, just like they did in the past with the geocentric model of the universe, right? They're using an ether model, basically. They just split it out just like they did, and they call it different fields and make it super complicated. If everything is just waves, then they're going to have to go back and totally revamp space-time, right? If everything is just waves, then they've been just wrong about ostracizing all of this work done by Dean Radin, ostracizing the telepathy tapes, right? All of those autistic kids who've been told that there was nobody in there, right? Now they're going to have to go back and look at that. It's going to be a lot of serious issues because now space time is fundamental. But if everything is just waves, then that means that particles, space time itself is not fundamental. So now they're going to have to go back and totally redo what is fundamental. It means that if waves are fundamental, then most likely consciousness is related, meaning that consciousness is going to be the base. Consciousness will be fundamental, as Dean Radin argued on my show. It manifests itself as waves. So what we see as particles is actually just wave on wave interaction. So now they're going to have to go back. Things like the psionic assets will be correct. And I think this has been suppressed on purpose. Nikola Tesla's work was taken by the government and is still classified to this day. Why is it still classified? Imagine you're the CIA and you knew for a fact that the ether existed, and you knew that certain people could read the minds of other people without them knowing. Don't you think you would keep that secret? Look at Christopher Columbus. I bet the only people that knew where they were going on that ship, who had access to the actual maps, was the captain and the navigator. I bet those maps were locked up super tight. Governments have always done this in the past. The only thing that would surprise me now is if modern governments didn't hide information like this, didn't suppress information like this. So, of course, if the CIA or other governments or parts of the government learn for a fact that this was true, they're going to keep it extremely secret. If they knew there's an underlying medium that could be used to produce weapons, such as scalar weapons. Or look at how Bob Salas, he was a missile man underground, right? He saw 10 missiles who are protected inside their own independent Faraday cages go offline. Imagine if you're a government and you know how to take offline your enemy ICBMs without going into their fortified structures, right? You can actually go through a Faraday cage and offline a missile. Imagine how important that information is to your nation. Do you think you're going to let a few people know this information, or the fact that you can read the minds of enemy personnel, maybe scientists, political leaders? Imagine those capabilities. Of course, you're going to keep it secret. Of course, you're going to suppress it. So I think this has been suppressed on purpose. There's a reason Nikola Tesla's work is still classified, right? There's a reason if you say anything about telepathy or do any sort of science for it, you're immediately disregarded, called a pseudoscientist, or they remove your actual credentials. But I think this stuff's all going to come to light. I think it's coming to light now. We have whistleblowers coming out. We have brave people like Michael Herrera. We have people like Courtney Brown who are willing to risk anything, really, all of their supposed credibility to go out there and try and find the truth. And as promised, what are some experiments that we can do to actually prove a wave-based view of reality is correct? So the first thing we can do is an extended double-slit experiment. So instead of electrons, we could use larger and more complex particles like molecules or even small biological structures, right? The interference pattern should persist. And if it does, that proves that even large objects are fundamentally waves. So this has already been done with molecules as large as 2,000 atoms. The next step, push this boundary further. Use, small poodles, right? If you shoot a poodle through a double slit experiment, can you prove a poodle is made of waves? Okay, next one we could do is a wave collapse experiment. So design experiments to measure when and how wave functions collapse. You've heard of the collapse of the wave function. So if collapse is just a wave interaction with a detector, as I'm arguing, right, it's just a wave-on-wave interaction with a detector, we should see evidence of wave interference right up until that interaction, right, even for so-called particles. Third one we can do is quantum field oscillation studies. So we can develop more accurate, precise tools to measure oscillations in those quantum fields, right, directly. If they're just fields, then we can measure them and relate to different scales. So by studying these oscillations at different scales, right, I'm arguing that there's one ether medium. We can identify wave interactions without invoking particle concepts. Fourth one is gravitational wave interference. If we look at the Michelson-Morley experiment, it sure looks a lot like your LIGO detectors, right? That detected gravitational waves. So gravitational waves are already known to interfere with each other. By detecting these interference patterns, we could further validate that even space-time itself is fundamentally wave-like. So the Michelson-Morley experiment, I think that's what we're doing with these large-scale gravitational wave detectors, right? Maybe they're already proving the ether. And then finally, another thing we can do is medium-free wave experiments. So we can test whether waves can propagate in conditions beyond the reach of any traditional medium. So, for example, you can simulate ultra-high vacuum conditions and observe quantum field oscillations to show that fields, not particles, are the fundamental carriers. We could also do, like mainstream science could do, what Dean Radin has done in his Ganzfeld experiments, is you put a person in a Faraday cage. So you make sealed off from any EM waves interference inside a Faraday cage, and now transfer information to that person. If you can prove that actually telepathy experiments are happening where people are receiving information through a Faraday cage, right? Now that has to be explained with some other medium. There has to be another medium that they're using to transfer that information. And that would also explain Bob Salas's his argument, right? That these 10 missiles were shut offline when they're inside their own independent Faraday cages, right? Sealed with really thick doors. Nothing should be able to affect those missiles. They're shielded against EMPs, right? From nuclear explosions. They're shielded against EMPs. So that is basically a medium-free wave experiment that you're showing that it has to go through somehow, right? There's something there. There is a medium. That's what they would prove. So I think these experiments are going to prove it. And I think it's already been done. It's just a matter of mainstream science looking over there, right? Disregarding the suppression, misinformation that's been placed on them in the name of national security, I believe. So these experiments would build on what we already know, pushing physics closer to a wave-centric view of reality. They're already there. Okay. They still have it broken up into different fields, different planes. So the answers are there. We just need to look at the universe through the lens of waves. So what do you think? Are we on the cusp? Are we ready to actually abandon particles altogether and embrace the wave revolution? Or are we just going to keep clinging to the past for another 80 years, wondering all these crazy concepts such as telepathy? How could that be possible? Astrology, how could that have any actual mechanism? All these things from the East, right? The religions from the East, Buddhism, etc., that were all interconnected, all one. Are we still going to cling to our space-time model? So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you're interested, I gave a breakdown of the Jeju crash, my own opinions, made a video and posted it for UAP Society Weekly News Show. So that's our sister channel, UAP Society. And I got the question from the LehtoFiles Discord. So if you want to post a question that you want me to answer, go to LehtoFiles Discord and join the conversation there. I was an F-16 pilot for 18 years, and I actually had bird strikes. So I talk about at least one bird strike I had in Turkey. And I think for the Jeju crash, it's probably going to come down to pilot error on this one, although there probably was bird strikes. Bird strikes do happen. I talked to Peter DeNucci. He was on the show a few weeks ago, commercial aviation safety expert. And we talked about Sully. Remember Sully? He actually had bird strikes that knocked out both of his engines of his 737. And he landed it belly up in the water, right? But with no injuries. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case with the Jeju crash. So go to the Discord. If you want to support my work, I really appreciate it. Go to patreon.com/Chris Lehto, and you get exclusive videos there. Or you can become a YouTube member. But thanks for being here. Thanks for listening. And I hope you learned something. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.